Hi, welcome back. This is Lesson 6, Part 2. I'm going to show you the same thing I showed you in Lesson 6, but from a different pipe. So this time, all your last row of stitches is going to be on the left. You will be casting off to the right pipe, and you will be making your join then from this left to right cast off. It will look the same way as I showed you in the last video in Lesson 6. And this method works when you're working stockinette or when you are doing a front one, back one, like I did on this scarf. This is 7 stitches across on the 1 5/8 inch pipe. It's 14 rows, and you'll see it appears the same way, that seam. So, the first thing you want to make sure, I already have this out almost to length. It turns out this yarn is shorter than the label said, so I'll be adding another row later. But you can see my stitch markers from where I cast on, and in this case I actually did cast on to this side of the pipe because I wanted my ends at the opposite ends of the scarf, the tails. So you'll see my stitch markers. So my first one is yellow, pink, blue, yellow, pink, blue, yellow. So I have, pink. So I have 8 stitches on here. Just as before, I've taken my working yarn, I've laid it over. You see my purl side is facing out. And the one thing you want to be careful of when you're doing your stockinette on a long scarf is not to have your scarf twisted when you join your ends. That was wrong. The purl side, the wrong side has to be together. So just as I showed you on the last video, you're going to hold, this time your working yarn is going to be in your left hand. And you will have your stitches up here. Let me turn this around again. So your first stitch marker is yellow, and you'll see that the tail is, from my cast on, is still at the front because I cast onto this pipe as well. But hold your working yarn, your 2 strands now, and I did 8 stitches, and hold your working yarn just as I showed you in the last video, this time in your left hand, and hold your yarn against your palm with your 2 fingers, and use these first 2 fingers and your fingers of your right hand to reach through and bring the working yarn through, and that creates your new stitch. Take off your first old stitch from the last row, place it over your working yarn, and take your working yarn now, that's your new stitch, and pipe it onto the right. You can snug that up. Your next stitch has to be pink. So you're going to bring your fingers through, make sure that you're through the entire stitch, feel your stitch marker, grab your working yarn, release the tension of your hand. You always need to have a little tension up here, you'll see it starts to drop. So hold the working yarn now out, bring the stitch off, put it over your working yarn, put the working yarn up on the pipe, that's your second new stitch, snug it up, take your first stitch, bring it over the second stitch, and let it drop. Your next stitch marker is blue, so use your fingers to bring your working yarn through the old stitch. Bring off the next stitch from your left pipe over the working yarn. Pull the working yarn up, put it on the pipe, take the previous stitch and bind off. Your next stitch marker is yellow, so just bring your working yarn through, take your stitch off, over the working yarn, place it up on the pipe. With the right hand now you're taking off that stitch and binding it over. You have 4 stitch markers left, and you have 4 stitches on the pipe, and that's as it should be. Each time you do this, again, just make sure you have all the stitch. You can just feel around the stitch marker and make sure that you're in the right place. It's easy enough when you have just 2 strands of yarn like this, but later if you start working with multiple strands of fuzzy yarn and things like that, you're almost going to be doing this blind. You're just going to be doing it by feel. It's much harder to see. So now your second to the last stitch, your yellow marker, bring your working yarn off. Each time you're snugging it up just a little bit before you bind off the previous stitch. And now again, this last stitch marker tends to twist just a bit, so you're going to use your fingers to bring your yarn back around. Put your fingers through the stitch, make sure you're through the whole stitch, Off comes the working yarn over, or the last stitch over the working yarn, and then pull the working yarn by releasing your tension here, putting it up on the pipe. Snug it up, bring off your stitch. Now you're left with your last stitch, and this is where, and I have a lot of yarn here, but you'll see I'm just going to go ahead and pull it all the way through and pull it. Now, when you open it up, it'll look just like it did on the last video. Kind of a wide seam. It won't look like much. But just do as you did before. Give each side some gentle pulls, and it will bring that to the center. And when you flip it over, you will see all your stitch markers, and you will take your finishing needle that I showed you and darn that in. So that's how it looks from the left. Now, if you are in garter stitch, things get a little dicey, and so I'm going to pull this back over here while Joe moves the camera around, and I'm going to put on another sample here and show you how to do this if you are doing a back stitch row. Now, in garter stitch, on the stationary rods, you're going to be making front rows and back rows. Sometimes you just can't help it. You're going to have to bind off while you are supposed to be making back stitches. So, when you go to do that, you are going to have to make a back stitch because you need to bind off in pattern. If you don't, your seam will be offset, and the part that's visible on the front side will be in one place, and there'll be another row on the other side, and you don't want it to look like that. So if you're in garter stitch, when you want to bind off, you are going to need to, again, make sure that you have the work is not twisted. In garter stitch, there's not really a wrong side or a right side. They're both the same. So just make sure they're going to sit up there flush. And you always have to go through, let me get my yarn around here. You always need to go through the old stitch, your stitch marker first. So that's what makes it tricky when you're supposed to be doing back stitches. So again, you've got your row of stitches. In this case, I cast on this pipe, the right pipe. So my tail is at the back, but that's neither here nor there. That all gets wound in. So when you go to start your cast off, when you are supposed to be doing back stitches, oops, I'm going to put my tape on there. You want to, first of all, bring your yarn over here. You want to take your working yarn and put it through the first stitch where the pink stitch marker is, just like you did before. Now, you've got to take this stitch off, and your yarn is down here. So you need, just like as if you were making regular back stitches, you need to bring your yarn up and over. Here's your row of stitches. Here's all your knitting is down here. Give yourself a little more length of that working yarn for that new stitch. Move these stitches a little forward. That'll help a little bit. So keep a hold of this. Bring that working yarn up and over. Bring your stitch off. Grab the working yarn, and it's the only way to do it. It's a little tricky, but otherwise you're going to twist your stitch, and you don't want to do that. So that was your first one. That was pink. Your next one is yellow. So do the same thing. Again, you must take your working yarn through the stitch with the stitch marker first. Bring your working yarn up and over your old stitches. Grab the stitch, the old stitch. Pull it off, grab your working yarn, pull it through. Now you have 2 stitches on. Take your first stitch, cast it over the second. You should have 3 stitch markers remaining, and for the 3 stitches on the pipe, come through your blue stitch, grab the working yarn, bring it up and over your old stitches. I'm reaching under with my fingers, I'm taking the stitch off, I'm grabbing the working yarn and pulling it through. I've tried other ways of doing this, and they end up twisting the stitch. So all you can do is, I think this is the best approach, is what I'm saying. So again, you're just taking your working yarn. Leave yourself a big loop so that you can come up. This time you're just going to grab the next to the last stitch, pull it off, then grab the working yarn again. You see what's happening? I've twisted it around there basically, but not twisted the stitch. You have one more left, and this is the one that gets turned around a little bit. Work your fingers in there. Grab your working yarn, pull it through. There's no stretch to this, it's a little trickier. So leave yourself a big loop so you can get up there, get your stitch, grab your working yarn, wrap it around, put your working yarn up, tighten it up, take it off. This is your last stitch. Now you just reach through with your fingers, grab the working yarn, pull it through, tighten it. As before, you're going to see an elongated rows of stitches that doesn't look very good until you then gently pull your sides, pull each side of your fabric until they line up. You sometimes have to straighten out one or two of those. But this way you are going to get a seam now that, like the others, the front and back line up, and all your stitch markers will be on the back, and now you can just weave in your ends as you did before. This is ribbon yarn that you're supposed to crochet or knit. When I'm working with this, I don't usually knot it. I actually sew it together, because otherwise that's rather a bulky knot. And there's one more thing I'm going to show you in terms of this business with weaving these ends together. When I first started doing this, I was only using half the stitch. And this is what it looks like. If you only use half the stitch rather than going around the whole V with your stitch marker at the beginning, you will get a seam that looks very similar to when you use the whole stitch around the whole one, but you'll get this extra border on the side. I don't think it looks as good, but it's less bulky because it spreads that out. So on a cowl, I prefer to go around the whole stitch because I think that looks prettier. But on a long infinity scarf, you might be satisfied to have it look like that because the bulk is a little less. So if you do that, what you're going to want to do is, you can do this two ways. So I'm just going to cast on a few stitches so you can see what I mean. So as always, you make your slip knot. That's old news, huh? And put that on there. Now, kind of sitting sideways in my chair. So put a couple of these on. Now normally, if you wanted to use the whole V, go around the whole stitch. So let's separate this out just a little bit. Again, this is the knot from your slip stitch. And you'll notice each of these little V's that's created, if you want to look at it that way, there's 4 stitches of yarn there. There's one side and the other. 4 strands. You're working with 2 strands in this case. And normally, if you want to produce a type of seam like we've been doing, you would go around all 4 of those strands. If you want something less bulky, like this, and you don't mind that extra row of stitching there, you can take your stitch marker now and just go through 2. Go one side of the V. And you can do that like this. And I will choose the one that looks the same as the next row. If you look carefully at your V, you'll see one is over and what is under the other. And you can do it that way. Or, if you prefer, you can actually put your stitch markers on your tail like this. Don't, leave them snapped. Put them up on your tail, as many as you're going to use. Let's say I need 2 more stitches. So I have them down and out of the way. Alright, this one doesn't have a stitch marker yet. So before I make my next stitch, okay, I will slide this up the yarn till it's abutting the previous stitch. Now I've got that hanging there. I'll make my next stitch. And now that one's already in place. If I want to make one more, now I slide another stitch marker up to the yarn, up to the stitch, These are sticky enough and small enough, they'll pretty much stay there on their own. And again, make another slingshot stitch. And now, these 2 stitches that I put on are already there. And then you would just knit as usual, and when you're done, instead of going around the whole stitch, when you make your cast off, you are just going to go where your stitch marker is, right between this opening. There's a little less space to work, but there'll be plenty for you to reach, either push it through with your finger or grab it. And that's all for today.